G'day! Welcome to Navadia. Hey everyone, and as we all know, I am a snake lover. Hence, this one climbing all over me. I also love to bring attention to dangerous things religion does and how we can combat them, or even just raise awareness of the damage that is being done. With this in mind, I want to bring up the subject of snake handlers in a very small sect of Christianity. And I do want to be clear, it is a very small sect. By the way, this is Lilith, who used to be called Lucius until I took her to the vet earlier this year. Yes, I was misgendering my snake, and I am sorry, sweetie. Anyway, back on topic. Snake handling is pretty much whatever it says on the tin. It's handling venomous, not poisonous snakes in religious gatherings. Venom is injected, poison is ingested. So that's the difference between the two. Please understand that because that annoys a lot of herpetological people. The historical origin is hard to find because there's evidence of it occurring throughout history. Despite its historicity, when you talk about snake handlers, most people think of a small Pentecostal sect in Appalachia. Again, this is a very small group and they do not represent the Appalachian people. The origin of this practice is a literal interpretation of Mark 16 verses 17 through to 19. And all these signs shall follow them that they believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. So then after the Lord had spoken unto them, he was received up into heaven and sat at the right hand of God. There is some debate in regards to the veracity of these verses. Some people say they do not apply to all Christians as they refer to the actions of the apostles immediately following the resurrection of Jesus. Some biblical scholars think verses 9 to 20 of the Gospel of Mark weren't part of the original manuscripts of the Bible and therefore they are not applicable. But authentic or not, these verses are now used to enable animal abuse. Snake handling was first believed to be introduced to Appalachia by an evangelist named George Went Hensley. When he was in his late 20s, Hensley had a religious experience where he asked himself if he was living a sufficiently righteous life. He became fixated on Mark 16. This supposedly was because he watched a woman doing snake handling early in his life in Virginia. Somewhere between 1908 and 1914, Hensley claimed that he asked for a sign of God while hiking on a mountain. He found a rattlesnake and fell on his knees in prayer. He took the snake from its environment, put it in a bag, and took it to his congregation. In his next service, he handled it where it didn't harm him, and he got the congregation to follow suit to show their faith. Hensley then spread the word of his snake handling practice throughout the American Bible Belt, including Tennessee, the Carolinas, Florida, Kentucky, Ohio, and Virginia. He drew large crowds and inspired others, such as Raymond Hayes, to spread this phenomenon. Hensley continued to worship like this until 1922 when he resigned from his church citing family troubles. In 1923, he was arrested for moonshining but escaped from his chain gang. He returned to preaching as before but never regained popularity due to his criminal past and the fact that he had been married 4 times. In 1943, Hayes and Hensley started a church where they preached snake handling. In 1945, one of the congregates was bitten and died, yet the members still continued to handle snakes, even at the funeral of the snake bite victim. Their reasoning was that the man's death was God's way to test their faith and to demonstrate to non-believers that the snakes were dangerous. Because clearly, a God that has to kill someone to make someone else affirm their faith is a God worth worshipping. In early July 1955, Hensley stopped his snake handling for approximately 3 weeks. He produced a 1.5 metre snake on the 24th of July, wrapped it around his neck, and preached with it. For a little bit of context, she's about 1 metre. As he was putting it back into the lard can he got it from, it bit him on the wrist. Within minutes, he became visibly ill with extreme pain, discoloured arm, and vomiting blood, and yet refused to accept medical treatment. One witness said that Hensley attributed his suffering to the congregation's lack of faith. He died the next day. His death was ruled as suicide. Out of curiosity, is suicide by stupidity a thing? The practice is still happening today. There's some speculation as many as 125 churches and up to 5,000 people practice snake handling, but it's hard to quantify that accurately. Some people have suggested as few as 40 churches and 500 people. The reason why these numbers are so varied is because snake handling is illegal in all states in America except for West Virginia. Also, congregation of snake handling are more likely to be found in people's houses or in abandoned buildings, making them harder to track. In addition to snake handling, people will often drink poison and touch fire to prove their faith in God. They usually use strychnine as their preferred poison, but will also occasionally use battery or carbolic acid. Apparently, if they're in the spirit, they will not be harmed. So, of course, when people are harmed, they blame the person for their injuries or death rather than, say, the fact that reality is a thing. Often a worshipper will handle multiple venomous snakes at the same time. But why are bites rare, even for the relatively small number of snake handlers? Let's have a look at some of the facts about rattlesnakes, the most commonly used snake in these churches. I watched a video on the temperament of rattlesnakes by Clint's Reptiles, and he breaks down if they make a good pet. Spoiler alert, they don't. But you should watch that video, it's got a lot of good information about rattlesnakes. In the video, he mentions that rattlesnakes are probably no harder to handle than most snakes, and as venomous snakes go, they're pretty easy to handle. You can often get away with free handling highly venomous snakes that have been socialized, like Lilith here. However, the problem is they're, venomous. If you own a snake, you will get bitten. It's not a matter of if, but when. The thing with venom is it is extremely expensive for snakes to produce. The vast majority of the time, a snake will not envenomate a prey item it cannot eat. Venom in rattlesnakes is used to incapacitate its prey, kill it, and start to pre-digest it, not as a defense. That's why symptoms of a rattlesnake bite include necrosis or death of surrounding tissue, hemophilia or bleeding easily, paralysis, and weakness. Collectively, the toxic cocktail causes death to the prey, not to predators. As a rule, they prefer to defend themselves in the following order. Stay still, rattle their tail and make themselves big, and even start hissing if their predator hasn't got the point. Strike out but miss. Strike out but not envenomate. Strike out and only envenomate a little bit. But the thing is, that little bit of envenomation will kill you if you don't get to a hospital. I'm in no way an expert snake keeper. I've only had snakes for about 1.5 years. But people who've been keeping snakes for decades still get bitten. That has nothing to do with husbandry, but everything to do with keeping snakes. Just like you would expect scratches if you have a cat, you need to expect to be bitten if you have a snake. Knowing this, why are snake bites so rare in these churches? The snake handlers do crazy things such as jumping up and down with the snakes in their hands, which is not what you want to do. Snakes don't like sudden movements. It stresses them out, which makes them more likely to bite. And considering they also handle multiple snakes at the same time, they still have a low chance of being bitten. Why is this? Is it God? Here's some footage from CNN on this subject. Please note the majority of the information I was able to find was from around about 2012, but I also found some articles about snake handling from as recent as March 2019. If you can see here, this woman who needed faith healing from emotional troubles has been given a rattlesnake. Look how it holds itself as she jumps around. Now look at the footage of Kevin McCurley from New England Reptile Distributors as he holds his rattlesnake. See how it's kind of floppy but still has a level of control? See how its head is kept upright? Have a look at Lilith. Have a look at how she's holding herself, especially around her head. I'm only just going to gently start bouncing her. Look at her head. By the way, that is not how you handle a snake, and they don't even like this level of bouncing. I'm sorry, Lilith. You're also not supposed to hold a snake from the middle. If you divide a snake into thirds, at least 2 of those thirds need to be contacting something. As you can see, this woman is only holding the snake at one point, its middle. What does this suggest? Well, NPR wrote an article about it, and let's just say it's not exactly surprising. In the article it says, NPR was contacted by snake experts who strongly suggest that a snake's reluctance to bite a religious serpent handler may have more to do with the creature's poor health than with supernatural intervention. The article goes on to quote Kristen Wiley, curator of the Kentucky Reptile Zoo. The animals that I have seen that come from religious snake handlers were in bad condition. They did not have water. The cages had been left not clean for a pretty long time. And another thing we noticed is there were 8 or 10 copperheads in a container that was not very large. They also speculated that the animals were not being fed either, as there was no fecal matter in the tank. This is explained in part of the article, which states, when we visited the snake room behind Coots's house, there were about 30 snakes, mostly timber rattlers and copperheads, crowded into large cages. Jamie Coots, the pastor at the Pentecostal church Full Gospel Tabernacle, says he waters them regularly, but that his supplier of live mice and rats moved away, and many of the snakes won't eat anyway. Anyone who knows anything about snakes will tell you a stressed out snake will not eat. Actually, anyone who knows anything about any animal will tell you that a stressed out animal will not eat. Overcrowding will cause stress, and saying that your supplier has moved away does not give you permission to not feed your snakes. Also, feeding live is so dangerous. To the snake, to you, especially since it's venomous, and it's obviously going to be a horrendous death for the prey. Just don't do it. I also question the husbandry. Were there hides? A heat source, suitable substrate, a rough area to assist shedding, a large enough water bowl so they can soak? In the CNN video I watched, I couldn't see much when it came to their husbandry, but from what I saw, there were no hides in the animals' enclosures, which is extremely stressful for the snake. They're not hard to get. I mean, I made this hide for Lilith with a yogurt container and she used this all the time. I didn't see any lighting, which would suggest to me they didn't have a UVB source. I couldn't see if there were any heat sources either, but that really doesn't mean much because you can get heat mats which are easily hidden. However, since these snakes lacked even a basic hide, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't have any heating. I only had access to this one piece of footage, so I can't say this is for certain, but from what I saw, these animals were housed very badly. A dehydrated, unfed, stressed animal is less likely to strike than a healthy snake. Also, the venom is weaker too. Keeping the animals in bad conditions leads to an ultimately safer interaction with them, which is why, despite interacting with multiple venomous snakes 3 days a week, people aren't getting killed by them as often as you think they should be. I suppose you're wondering how long the animals survive? Well, quoting the NPR article again, Coots said the animals live an average 3 to 4 months. The Kentucky Reptile Zoo says that in captivity, well cared for snakes should live up to 20 years. If that doesn't make your blood boil, then Coots' response will. People who don't believe in it are going to say anything to try and discredit us. You know, to say it's not God actually doing it. They're not discrediting you, they're speaking out against blatant animal abuse, In Kentucky, where Coots' church is based, keeping a rattlesnake as a pet is illegal without a permit. In 2008, he was arrested and fined by the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife for tracking in illegal venomous snakes. He ended up getting the permit required, which I find disgusting. I found an American Broadcasting Corporation clip about snake handlers, and they talk about a preacher called Andrew Hamblin. He lives in Tennessee, where using venomous snakes for worship is illegal and has been since 1947, where 5 people in churches died over a 2-year period. Hamblin catches his own wild snakes, which is doubly illegal because it's A, illegal to take wild animals into captivity, and B, trafficking said venomous animals. But his attitude is that the government stopping him from using snakes in his sermons is the equivalent of the government coming into his house and stealing his Bible.
If God moves on me and I feel led through him by the Holy Ghost to reach my arm into a box of rattlesnakes, I should have my religious right to do that.
Let's break this down, shall we? If you were anyone else, you would be charged with a crime. You cannot hide behind your religion to break the law. Just like a person cannot claim their religion to deny someone in their care medical treatment and get away with it. Snake handling is also not protected by the First Amendment. State courts have kept challenges to law out of the Supreme Court because it comes under reasonable health and safety regulations. Bizarre thought, isn't it? Not being able to handle a highly venomous animal because of health and safety regulations. Gee, I just can't see why the law would think that. Hamblin also says, I'd like there to be some kind of law saying that in religious ceremonies, consenting adults can do this as part of our religious beliefs and our religious practice. The government basically tells us that we can have our religious beliefs, but not our religious practice. It's just not right. Laws are there to protect you. You can just as easily pray to God without the snakes. Millions of people worldwide are able to do it perfectly fine without the animal abuse or the deaths of thousands of snakes, not to mention the congregates. But of course, he considers it to be a form of Christian persecution, because being required to follow the same laws as everyone else is clearly an attack on his faith. Frankly, I just think he wants to perform Christian persecution autofellatio, but that's just me. I definitely could be wrong. I just want to finish this up by talking about some recent research on rattlesnakes to give you an idea of how horrible this situation is for these animals, if what I have told you already hasn't convinced you. From a website called animalcognition.org, they interview a woman called Melissa Amorello. She's one of the founders of Advocates for Snake Preservation, so be aware there's likely a bias in her information. She is, however, a researcher in snake behaviour, so that lends some credibility to her claims. This article cites where they got their information from, so that's a good thing. Unfortunately, they all relate back to Melissa's research. However, on the other hand, I have found papers that do support her hypotheses. Melissa's studies have shown that rattlesnakes care for their young, they associate more with genetically related snakes, aka they form kin relationships, they return back to breeding dens when the snake was born, and they show parenting behaviours. Rattlesnakes will babysit newborns and they will care for their young. They do this by herding them, protecting them from dangers, and sharing heat. There's even anecdotal evidence that rattlesnakes form friendships, but as we know, anecdotal evidence is not necessarily evidence. These behaviours suggest that rattlesnakes have a complex social structure. Now, knowing this, and knowing the conditions that the snakes are put in for the name of worshipping a god, you can see how this makes a profoundly stupid act of worship into a profoundly evil act of animal cruelty. They take a socially complex animal out of the wild. They subject it to loud sounds and frequent rough handling. They jump around with it. They house it in cages that are too small and with inadequate husbandry. These cages are often overcrowded with rattlesnakes of different species. The animal becomes so stressed it doesn't eat. Either that or it isn't offered food. Then it dies generally within 3 to 4 months. All in the name of praising a god that won't even protect someone who gets bitten by those snakes. As far as I'm concerned, these people can drink poison and set themselves on fire as much as they want to. I don't care. But as soon as they start treating an animal like that, it crosses the line, and they should have every book in existence thrown at them. Thankfully, this practice is on the decline and should hopefully be extinct soon. Most Pentecostals distance themselves and reject the handling of snakes, drinking of poison, and using of fire as practices of worship. And if you get rejected by Pentecostals for your crazy religious practices, there's something very wrong. All of my links are in the description below. I've also linked an article about rattlesnake roundups, which is an entirely different kettle of fish, and I really want to bring your attention to it. It's really quite depressing to read about it. So please, if you live in a place near a rattlesnake roundup, I ask you to do some research and lobby your local government to ban the practice. It's just so sad. Oh, and one last thing. Remember how I said a lot of this information was old? Well, I was able to find out a few things about Jamie Coots, the first pastor I talked about. In February 2015, Jamie Coots was bitten on the right hand by a snake. He continued the sermon, went home, refused medical treatment, and then died. How did they rule his death? Suicide by stupidity? Will the whole congregation eventually receive a Darwin Award? Only time will tell. What about Andrew Hamblin? Well, he was arrested in 2015 for aggravated assault and 6 counts of reckless endangerment. He pointed a gun out of a window of a vehicle and followed Elizabeth Hamlin and Jeremy Henniger home. He shot once into the air and once towards Henniger, missing the house he was in front of. According to La Follette Press, he was sentenced to split confinement of 150 days with a jail credit of 134 days and 6 years of supervised probation. He is also required to complete a batterer's intervention program, undergo a drug and alcohol assessment, as well as a mental health assessment, and follow the directives he receives from those. He is also required to have no contact with the victims unless authorised by Domestic Relations Court. Interesting times for interesting people. Anyway, thank you for watching, and don't forget, don't give yourself the raw prawn. I just want to say a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons, especially my $10 Redback Spider patrons, Aided Furball, Lauren Hart, Mary Civitano, Amanda Vogue, Ross Devereux, and Atheist Pastor. I also want to say a very special thank you to my $35 Irukandji patron, Osman Cometh. I really hope you learnt a little bit more about snakes today, especially rattlesnakes. They're really quite a fascinating species and not as scary as what most people think they are.